My name is Ellen Holste. I'm Community Program Manager at Pierce Cedar Creek Institute. We are trying out a new format today with our virtual Lunch and Learn, so please be patient with us today if technology thwarts us a little bit. Sometimes that happens. But this was a program that we were planning to do in May anyway, so I was really excited when Dr. Ann Fraser said she could do it, as well as her student Niko. So today we have with us Niko Nickson, I believe so. I apologize, Niko, as well as Dr. Ann Fraser from Kalamazoo College. I will let them introduce themselves. So I'm going to turn it over to our speakers today. But I want to ask Dr. Fraser, why did you get interested in bees?
Okay, so I teach biology at Kalamazoo College. I've been here for 17 years now. And I would say it was about 3 or 4 years into my time at Kalamazoo College, I was teaching an entomology course, so an insect course, and students make a collection for that course. And in those collections, I was seeing they had all kinds of different bees. And I had no idea there were so many different bees in Michigan. And I was searching around for a new study system to do research on that was more local because I had been working in Australia. And I thought, well, maybe I'll work on bees. So I just started investigating bees, and that's how I got into them.
Awesome. Yeah, I also have had the same thing of, wow, there's so many more bees than the honeybees. So I totally get that. All right. And do you want to start your screen or share your screen and get going?
Sure.
I'm going to mute myself.
Yeah. And maybe before I do, I'll just let Niko just introduce himself quickly.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Niko Nickson. I am a junior at Kalamazoo College, and this is my second summer working with Dr. Fraser. And so I'm excited that all of you are tuned in today and look forward to this presentation.
Okay. So yeah, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen, and I just want to take us through a little bit of the biology of bees, the diversity of bees, and the decline of bees. And then Niko at the end will talk about a new project that we've got underway that we're inviting you to get involved with. So here we go. Okay, here we go. I'm going to start us off with a quiz. So I'm going to put up this slide. So here are some different insects. And I want you to look at those and see how many of those do you think are bees. I'll just give a second to people for that. So let's see, I think 6 out of 10 of these are bees. So I'm just going to go to the next slide that shows us, I'm going to cross out which ones aren't bees. All right. So number 1 is a fly, 3 is a butterfly, 5 is a grasshopper, and then 9, it's fuzzy like a bee, and it's got that constricted waist like a bee, but it doesn't have any wings. That's a type of wasp. All the rest are bees, and number 8 is our honeybee. But this is to show, there's quite a diversity of bees. These all look pretty similar in size, but there's quite a range. Bumblebees are about the biggest up at number 2. But the colors are very different too, but they all have some common characteristics. So let's look at that. So what is a bee? Bees are related to wasps, and so they have a constricted waist, which is kind of hard to see in these pictures here, but they do have a very skinny waist. They have pretty long antennae, and they collect pollen, and some of them can pack it onto their legs, or they might pack it on the underside of their abdomen, or just on the hairs on their body. But they've got these pollen collecting hairs and other structures. And those hairs, if you were to look under a microscope, what you would see is that those hairs actually have little branches in them. So that's an adaptation for holding on to that pollen. If they were just straight hairs with no branches, then the pollen would fall right off. So that's something you need a microscope for, but it is something that is characteristic of bees. And the wasp relatives don't have those branched hairs, even though some of them look very similar to bees. So just distinguishing bees from other insects that might look like them. So our bee in the upper left here, quite hairy, Wasps, you can see that constricted waist. They also have long antennae, but again, the hairs aren't going to be branched, which isn't much help without a microscope. But they're not very hairy because they don't collect pollen. They mainly go to flowers for nectar or to prey on other insects. So that's some wasp lookalikes in the top panel, and then down below, some of these are parasitic wasps that don't look much like bees at all, but some of them look strikingly like bees. And difference between bees and wasps. So bees are descendants of wasps, a type of wasp, but wasps are carnivores, so they eat meat, and not so much the adults, but the what they feed to their young, nectar and pollen, which are both plant products, so that makes them herbivores. And there are some flies that look remarkably like bees. So again, in the upper left, we have our bee, and then we have some panels here with, this is a type of hoverfly, the upper left one. And then second one is another type of hoverfly, or sometimes this one's a hoverfly, looks a lot like a bumblebee. But what you'll see is they have these huge eyes. So they have really big eyes, the flies, and they tend to have pretty short antennae. So those are some good distinguishing characteristics. Here's another bumblebee type in the lower left. And this one is predatory, so it's preying on a Japanese beetle right now. And then in the lower right, this is called a bee fly. So it's very fuzzy like a bumblebee. It's got this long needle-like proboscis, like a mosquito. And these ones are actually pretty common this time of year. So if you're out walking around on paths in, I know at our arboretum, I'll often see it flying ahead of me on the path. But they all have these really big eyes. And so bees, they're herbivores, and so they need nectar and pollen. The nectar mainly for the adults, just to fuel their activities. But for the young, they need a mixture of nectar and pollen. So the pollen is really important. And right now, this time of year, the willows are blooming. They produce a lot of pollen, so you might see bees on those. There's a lot of spring wildflowers right now, so those are attracting a lot of the native bees. And so they're going to bring those back to the nest and make little dough balls of nectar and pollen, and then lay their eggs on those. Most bees do this. Honeybees are a little unusual. And then the larva just feeds on that little, what they call bee bread. And because they collect pollen, then they are really important pollinators. So there's lots of insects that visit flowers, but bees are by far, the predominant pollinators that actually help the plants move their pollen and set seed. And it's estimated that about 2/3 of all flowering plants are pollinated by animals of some sort. Most of those are insects, and of those, most are bees. And about 1/3 of all the food crops that we eat require pollination in order to produce that fruit. So about every third bite of your food, you can mostly thank the bees for that. And when we think of pollination and food, we tend to think of the honeybee. So the European honeybee, it was brought over to North America in the 1600s. So it's not a native species to North America. And it's probably your most atypical bee. It doesn't have a lifestyle like most other bees. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But we use them commercially because they have huge colonies, so we can bring them into agricultural settings and all of a sudden have lots of bees for pollination. But what I want to hopefully help you appreciate today is that there's lots of native bees already living out there that do a lot of pollination. So if you're not farming on a big scale, honeybees, you probably can get by with the native bees for the amount of pollination that you need. So in North America, so the poster on the right is just showing the diversity of some of the bees of North America. And you can see lots of diversity in size and in color and in patterns. Worldwide, there's about 20,000 species of bees or different types of bees. And if we just look in North America, that goes down to about 4,000, but still 4,000 different kinds of bees in North America. And a recent survey in Michigan cataloged all the different bee species that have been recorded from Michigan and came up with a list of 465 different kinds of bees. And at Cedar Creek, I had a student who did a survey there back in 2007. So one summer we surveyed bees there, and we got 73 different types of bees at Cedar Creek. And that isn't a complete list. We obviously didn't get all of them. So in any one area, you can find up to 100 different kinds of bees. Many of them look similar to one another, but they are unique species. So some of the different kinds of bees that are out there, and most of these are native bees. So that means they were already living in this area before the European settlers came. So they've been here for thousands, millions of years. So bumblebees, these are big black and yellow fuzzy bees. And so right now in the spring, you're probably seeing lots of bumblebees, big ones flying around low to the ground. Those are new queens that spent the winter in the ground, and they are out looking for a new place to start a nest and getting some energy reserves to start rearing their first group of workers. So they don't survive the winter as a colony like a honeybee does. Only these new queens survive. So that's they're definitely very prominent right now this time of year. And then carpenter bees on the right, upper right here, they're very similar to bumblebees. They're similar in size, but the difference is if you look at their hind end, the abdomen, it's very shiny because it doesn't have a lot of hair on it. And so these are native bees as well, and they're pollinators. They can be a nuisance if they start boring into the wood in your house, but there's ways to get around that if you can maybe put some posts out that they can use instead of your house. Oops, sorry. And then the small carpenter bees, so these are related to the large carpenter bee above, but much smaller and metallic blue, and they're pretty abundant throughout the year. Somebody mentioned that the green bees were their favorite, so here's some of the green bees. So these are types of sweat bees, and they are really a metallic green. And they should be, if they're not out already, they'll be coming out this month. So they're pretty common in May. So I would say watch the flowers around your yard, and you're almost certain to see some of these bees. Some of them are pretty common. And then there's other types of sweat bees. There's one particular, what we will call a genus of bees, Lasioglossum. There's 115 different kinds of this type of bee, and they're very common. And they range in size from tiny little bees up to smaller than honeybees, but medium-sized bees. And then the mason bees, so these are the ones that if you have seen the bee houses in the grocery stores or home improvement stores, garden shops, that's the types of bees that are going to come to those. And so mason bees are ones that collect their nectar and pollen, but they nest in stems or in tubes, and they collect their pollen on the underside of their abdomen. So that's something you might look for. And this one on the left is, I've had quite a few of those coming to my bee nests already this year. And then related to the mason bees are the leafcutter bees. So this is the other major type within that group that collects the pollen on the underside of their abdomen. So you can see that really clearly in the left-hand photo. So leafcutter bees, instead of collecting some mud to make partitions between the cells where they're going to have each of their young, they collect leaves and do that. So you can look around your yard and see if you see these circular cuts in some of your leaves. I find them pretty commonly on my redbud. They seem to like that type of leaf for this. And so what they do is they just make little cups out of that, and then they build a spot to put their bee bread and lay an egg on that. But they do it in tubes like the mason bees do. So they'll nest either in tubes, or some of them will nest in the ground. And then the minor bees, these are spring bees. They're out right now. If you go look at any of the spring wildflowers that are flowering in the woods, you're going to see lots of minor bees. And these live in the ground, so that's why they're called minor bees, because they dig into the ground. And various sizes, but they tend to have pretty hairy faces and hairy bodies. So that might be something to look for those. And then one final one that's kind of unique, and this one you're going to see more towards late summer into the fall, and these are the squash bees. So they look kind of like honeybees, but their antennae are a little bit longer, and the striping on their abdomen is more pronounced. But these ones are specialists on squash blossoms. So if you have squash or zucchini growing in your garden, definitely check those blossoms out. You're bound to see some of these bees in there. We have a hoop house right on our campus here, and I saw some of those bees in the hoop house this last summer. So that's a bit of a tour of some bee diversity. And in terms of abundance, so this is just a graph showing numbers of bees over different months. And this is that project that we did at Cedar Creek back in 2007. But May, early spring, April to May is the heyday for bees. So most of the bees were living in the ground during the winter, and they're coming out now, and they're going to come out en masse. So you're going to find the most different types of bees early in the spring, and you're going to find the most individuals, the greatest number of bees in early spring. And then they're going to drop off as the season warms. Because some of these bees, they come out and they do all their business in the month of May, and then they produce their young, and those young just sit there until next spring, and then they're going to come out. So do get out and look at the plants in your yard. The redbud is just starting to flower, and that's a good plant for bees in the spring. I mean, it's a tree, but redbud trees are really nice plants for bees, lots of flowers early in the spring. So if you have a redbud tree, go out and look at those blossoms. And so we've got lots of different types of native bees. Some people call them wild bees because they don't live in managed hives like honeybees. They just live out on their own. And there are some wild bees that are not native that were brought over. You find this time of year is actually not a native bee, it's an introduced species. So sometimes we use that word wild bees. But honeybees are great pollinators. A lot of it because of their anatomy, but also just sheer numbers. And native bees, because they grew up here in Michigan, they are used to our cool springs. Like this week and next week, it's pretty cool. And honeybees don't like rainy weather, so they don't go out as much as things like bumblebees when it's wet outside. And bumblebees will be out first thing in the morning, whereas the honeybees are going to wait till it warms up. So we can get more bee activity from our native bees because they're adapted to those weather conditions. And we've got lots of diversity of them. And then there's another cool thing that a number of native bees can do, and that's called buzz pollination. So this middle photo is showing a bumblebee on blueberry flowers. And blueberry is a plant where the pollen-producing stamens are hidden kind of inside this flower. And the bees can't really get into the flower. So what the bumblebees can do is that they can sonicate these plants. So they hang on to the flower and then they vibrate their wing muscles at a particular frequency. And that vibration causes the pollen to be released, and it kind of spits out and lands on the bee. And so I've got a video of that. And you won't see the pollen spitting out, but what you're going to hear is the change in the frequency of the bumblebees buzzing. So when it's flying, it's a very low frequency. And then when it lands on the plant to do that sonication, it's a very high pitched. So I'm going to hopefully play that video for you and see if you can hear the difference. And this is filmed in my backyard on a type of anemone that flowers in the fall. But a good plant for this in the spring is Solomon seal, because that's one where they have trouble accessing the pollen. Okay, so listen for the sound of the bees buzzing and see how it changes. So there's a low frequency. Oh, there's the high. You go to another flower. There's a low. Okay, so hopefully you got that. Honeybees can't do that, but you can't hear, the honeybee cannot buzz pollinate. So there are certain flowers that it's not a very good pollinator of, like blueberries are a good example. Okay, so the honeybees, as I mentioned, they have an atypical life cycle, not like other bees. So bees can live either in groups or they can live solitarily, and honeybees live in massive groups. So you can get 40,000 bees in a beehive, and their life cycle, they have a division of labor. So they have a queen who's going to lay the eggs, and the workers construct cells. The queen lays the egg, then the workers come and they feed the bees. So instead of making that pollen ball and giving them all the food they need, they come visit them daily and they feed them. And then those young grow up, the workers cap off their cells, and then the new bee emerges out of that cell. So here we have a division of labor where we've got a queen, we've got lots and lots of workers, and then we've got what are called drones, and those are the male bees. And those are males don't do much, they don't do work. They're there for helping produce more bees by mating with new queens. So honeybees are social. So they have that queen. Here's the queen. She's a little bit bigger than the workers. And we have lots of workers, and then we have some drones that are mainly produced towards the end of the season. So we can get 10,000 to 50,000 workers in that hive. And honeybees are unusual in that the queen and all the workers will survive the winter. And they can do that because they store up lots and lots of honey that they can feed on over the winter, because they've got to keep that hive temperature well above the outside. And so that's unusual that the whole colony survives the winter. And that's why we get so much honey from them, is they're storing it up for themselves. And we just take the excess and leave enough for them to get through the winter. So that was one reason why the Europeans brought them over, was for honey. But they also produce wax that they make their cells from. And so that's a nice resource. Now, bumblebees, they're also what we would call a social species. So they live in groups. There is a queen. She's typically larger than the workers. And they do have little honey pots in the hive where they will put some honey, but they don't store large amounts because they don't all survive the winter. So the only bee that's going to survive the winter is actually not the queen bee from this year, but the ones that she produces in the fall that then go out and mate. And then they just hunker down under leaf litter and in logs over the winter, and then they come out in the spring. So what you're seeing right now are the new queens that emerged last fall, mated, stored up some energy, and then made it all the way through the winter. So their big challenge right now is, one, finding a place to build their nest because they're not going to nest in the old burrow where the old nest was. And the other is being able to get enough food to build up some reserves so they can rear their first group of workers because they don't have any workers yet. So having lots of spring wildflowers around is really helpful to those bumblebees. So we call bumblebees like an annual species because the whole colony, except the new queens, die out every year. And you can build nest boxes for these bees. They don't tend to inhabit them very readily. Last summer, I had a student working on a project, and we built some and put them out at our college's arboretum. We didn't get any bees moving in. This year, we put them out a little bit earlier, and so we'll be checking on them to see. But they're wooden boxes where you've got a chamber where the bee can build their nest. Some of them actually have an antechamber too. Ours were just all one chamber, but a small hole. And then you put a little cotton batting, or if you had old mouse nests that you could put in there, and that's what they're going to use, or some moss. They like something soft to start the nest on. So most bees are not social. They don't live in groups. They're what we call solitary bees. And so there are no workers. There's just a female bee that lays eggs and provides the food for the young, and the males that mate with those females. And then those females the young that come out will either be new males or new females that will start another life cycle. So typically right now, a lot of the spring bees are coming out. Most of them nest in the ground. So they're coming out of the ground. And so they spent the winter there. Those female bees, they'll mate with male bees that are coming out right now too. And then she'll fly around and she'll find nectar and pollen. And she'll dig a little tunnel into the ground or into a stem nest. And she'll make little balls of nectar and pollen. And that essentially is all a set amount of food, lay an egg on it, and then she'll cap that off with mud or with leaf. And then she'll make another one and another one. So she'll do like a stack of them. And so then the larva will just feed on this bee bread, and that'll take a couple of weeks, and they'll go through a few molts as they grow. And then finally they pupate, or they form that chrysalis. And so that might be another week. And so then here all the bee bread is gone, and we've just got the pupa that's left. And it will, if we have multiple generations in 1 year, then this thing will metamorphose and come out as the adult a little later in the summer and do this whole life cycle again itself. Other ones, they only do it once a year. So the females that are coming out right now are doing this, and those larvae will get to this stage, and they are going to sit like that until next spring, and then they are going to come out. So that's common in some of our early spring species. They just like the cool spring weather. So with these solitary bees, then the female, once she gives the food to or she lays the egg on the food that she collected, she caps that off, and she doesn't come back and feed them again. This is what they get. So she doesn't provide any parental care like we would see in honeybees or in bumblebees. So that's the difference with all our solitary bees. And as I say, most bees are solitary. So where do these solitary bees nest? Most of them nest in the ground. So you might see this time of year a little hole with some loose dirt around it. If it's a hole that's about the size of a pencil, it's probably not an ant hole because it's too big for ants. And it's bees that have been underground and now they're coming up. And if you were to look at that nest, what you would see is on the left-hand side here, she would make multiple chambers in there, and each one of those would have a single bee in it. And so the bee bread, and she just lays an egg. And then when she finishes provisioning all of those, she is just going to close that off because she never comes back to visit them. And you would never know they're there until those bees come out next spring. So that's a typical ground nesting. This time of year, so in the last couple of weeks, there's been one species is a type of cellophane bee that tends to nest in huge aggregations, but each female has her own tunnel. And those ones have been coming out in the last week or two. So walking around my neighborhood, there's areas where I would just see hundreds of holes in the bees coming out. The nice thing about solitary bees is they're not, because they don't live in a social group, they're not, they don't have a lot of young that they need to protect, because they're just going to cap this off and leave. So the bees that you see flying around, they're not aggressive at all, because they're not defending a big nest of all their siblings. They're just doing their one little nest, and that's it. So these bees, they can sting like most bees can, but they're very, very unlikely to do so unless you grab them and really perturb them. So you can go right up to these nests and not worry about it. In the fall is when you tend to see the ground nesting wasps, and that nest hole is bigger, and there is a colony of wasps in there, and they are aggressive. So those are different than our ground nesting bees. And so most nest in the ground, but as I said, there are the stem nesting bees, the mason bees, the leafcutter bees, and so you can buy prepared nests. So these are bamboo stems. They will naturally use burrows that were made by wood-boring beetles. You can take old plant stems and cut those to size and just tie them up somewhere in a sheltered area. So here's an example of what you would see inside the stem. Here's that bee bread in the lower right, and you can see an egg on top of it. I've got this picture turned sideways, so but you can see the mud divisions between each of those cells. So each one of those is going to develop a bee. And I'll show you a couple of examples that we have. So again, the mason and the leafcutter bees are the ones that are going to use those. And then on the bottom, the small carpenter bee is also a stem nester. So you can help the bees by providing some stems for them to nest in. Not that many bees use stems, though. And so here's an example of some, when they're capped off. So after the bee has filled it up, here's the mud on the end on the right-hand side. You can see the mud that's capped these off. Some you may see grass sticking out of them. And these are actually wasps. So there are solitary wasps that collect caterpillars and stuff them in these tubes. And then their larvae, they lay their eggs and the larvae eat the caterpillars. And so if you see that grass, that's a type of wasp. There are some wasps that put mud there as well. But they're good wasps. They can serve as biological controls. So they can be beneficial. And here's just a short video. This is a bee nest in my backyard. So you can see this is the traffic. This is an introduced Osmia species, a type of mason bee. But yeah, we just saw one go into the new tube there. So each tube would have somewhere between around a dozen different young developing in there. But once she caps it off, she won't come back. And here's an X-ray inside of those tubes. So the student who was working last summer, we put out a bunch of these stem nests as well as the bumblebee nests. And then we sent the tubes off to get them X-rayed to see, well, what's in them, because they weren't going to come out until this spring. And what you can see is some of these are bees, and the bees are still in the larval stage, but you can see the partitions between each of the cells. And so we have, 10 or so in there. And these ones are wasps. So they developed a little bit faster, and they're at the pupa stage. And so the people we sent them off to, they do this all the time. So they were able to tell us, oh, these ones are wasps and these are bees. So we're just waiting for those to come out now so we can actually identify the species. But that's what it would look like inside. And you can see on the very end how they've capped it off on the left-hand side. So just a little word about bee nests. So you can buy some commercially or you can make some. Some are better than others. So if you're going to go with this one on the left-hand side that's like a drilled block, you can't really clean out those holes. And there could be pathogens and stuff. So for bees to reuse those is not advisable. So this type is not as good as ones where you can just change out the straws, but you can put straws, paper straws, into these, and then take those paper straws out and put new ones in, and reuse them that way. So if you're going to use that type, I would recommend getting some straws. You can buy paper straws online. The one on the right is one, I purchased one of these from Costco last year. And there's two different, there's bamboo on the left-hand side and the right. And then in the center are these blocks that are kind of drilled and stacked one on top of one another. So you can take them apart. And these are nice because you can, after the bees have nested in them, you could open it up and see what those cells actually look like. And once they've formed the cocoons, you can scrape those cocoons out and put them separate, clean off these blocks, and then put them back in to nest. So some bee nests that you find, the straw length is pretty short, and they say that they typically like about 6 inches. So if you see one that's only about 2 inches, that's probably not very good for the bees. Some of them, the bamboo that's in them is too big for our types of bees we have around here. And so I would recommend the tests we did last year, 6 millimeter and 8 millimeter were good sizes for those. And I think I'm gonna stop my sharing there for a second and just show you a couple of things. So this is an example of one of the bee nests that we built, or we got this idea from the 4-H club that was doing a citizen science project. So it's a piece of PVC pipe with a plug on the end, and then we would put a little bit of clay. Then you can remove that end, put a little bit of clay on that end, and then these are the paper straws. So you can buy these. I bought them on Amazon, and then I just cut them to length. This is a 6-inch length, and 8 millimeters or 6 millimeters seem to be good sizes for our mason bees and our leafcutter bees. So you can make these yourself. You can even just roll up, if it's a drill block, you can roll up pieces of paper. And then I just stuff enough in that they don't stick out the end. I would cut these ones off. But different sizes are good. And then stuff them in tight enough. The birds might come along and try and pull out the straws. So try and get them in there really tight. And then I just hang them in a tree, and then just leave them there until next spring. So those are some examples there. And then here's an example. Yeah, let me see. Here's an example of a cutaway of one of these stem nests. So in the bottom are the bees that came out of it. And then you can see the individual cells that were in there, I hope. So that's just an example of one of them. The other thing that I've used for straws, if you have a lot of Phragmites around your property, or know where there is some, that makes for good stem nests. And you just want to make clean cuts so they're not too jagged, because that could tear the bees' wings as they go inside. So I think, Ellen, I might stop at this point and just ask if there's some questions right now before we move on.
We do have quite a few questions.
Oh, okay.
So some are related to bee houses. So why don't we start with those, since you were just talking about it?
Mm-hmm.
Lindsay had a question of, do mason bees hibernate in bee houses in winter?
Yes, they do. Yeah. So they're going to be like at the pupa stage, that chrysalis, during the winter, and then they're going to come out in the spring. Mm-hmm.
All right. Cameron asked, sorry.
So I was going to say, so if you wanted, you could take those, straws out of your nest and just bundle them up and hang them just in the tree like that, and then put fresh straws in the spring in your nest.
Okay. Cameron asked, will bees use old stumps with holes drilled into them, or decaying stumps?
Yes, they will. Yes, absolutely. So, those old stumps are good to have around.
And Dave asked, do leafcutter bees use tube nests as well?
Some of them do, yes. And so they'll use the tube nests. They'll also use plants that have hollow stems. So things like raspberry, sumac. There was a type of vetch that I found some of the leafcutter bees in last year. Mhm.
All right, a couple of other questions we have is, do all bees pollinate, from Tracy on Facebook?
No, they do not. So there are some bees that are what we call freeloaders. So they don't collect their own pollen. They would have to feed on nectar just for energy. But what they do is they go into other bees' nests and they lay their eggs like on that bee bread. And so they eat the food that the other bees have collected. So those minor bees, the spring bees, there's another group of bees that are specialists on just going in and parasitizing those nests.
We have freeloaders in every system. All
Mhm.
right. And why are sweat bees called sweat bees? Jane was asking.
I believe that comes from that they like to they're after the salts that are in our sweat. And so when you're sweaty, they're attracted to that and they will drink, the moisture that's on your arm or whatever and get some minerals from that.
Awesome. A couple other questions. Are squash bees the only insect that pollinate squash and pumpkins?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think that they're highly attracted to them, and so they're very effective pollinators of them. So if you have some squash flowers, watch them this fall, summer, and fall, and see, well, are there other kinds of bees in there as well?
All right, and one more question we're going to do right now. John was asking, sometimes we'll have bees buzzing around our deck on warm winter days, and then they'll become a pile of dead bees as it gets cold in the evening. Is that a normal thing?
Yeah, so those would be honeybees, I'm guessing. Um, so the honeybees, because they vibrate their wing muscles inside the hive in the winter to keep the temperature up. So the temperature inside there is like in the 50s, even when it's freezing outside. But if we get a warm day, because they are still active in the hive, and a warm day, they will go out, and they're cold-blooded animals. So when the temperature falls, they get inactive, and if they didn't get back to the hive in time, then you're going to have a pile of dead bees. Yeah,
So sad.
yeah.
Uh,
But it's a small number of them from the whole hive, I would think, that are leaving.
We have a few other questions, but why don't we leave them to the end and keep
Okay.
going?
Yeah, and I think um, I want to leave time for Nico to talk about our citizen science project. So I think, the other stuff I want to mention was just, that there is a general decline in bees as there is in all insects. And so there's lots of things that we can do to help them. Feed them. So plant native plants that they grew up with that provide lots of floral resources. Shelter them. So find places for them to shelter. And that could be some bare ground in your yard, not too much mulch on some of your flower beds, and then and stem nests, and then don't kill them. So avoid spraying pesticides whenever possible. And there's a particular class of pesticides called neonicotinoids or neonics. And those are ones that are particularly harmful to pollinators because when they get sprayed on the plant, even if it's not during a bloom period, it absorbs into the plant and circulates and ends up in the pollen and the nectar. So the bees can be impacted by that. Okay. So yeah, let's turn it over to Nico. He wants to talk about a project that we've started, and this is part of his research for his senior thesis as well. So, but it's a program that we're getting started that we hope will continue for many years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Anne. We will move to the PowerPoint. Uh, okay. So, as Dr. Fraser talked about, we have officially launched our citizen science program, and we are particularly focusing on bumblebees. So, there are a lot of native bees in Michigan, but bumblebees are what we're going to focus on for this project. So, a quick background on citizen science. Citizen science is research that engages the public's participation for whatever the project may be. The whole premise behind it is that it allows expansion beyond just one research team and gets the community involved in a way that puts a lot of eyes in a lot of places and vastly increases the data that's able to be collected. On another hand, too, citizen science is great because it engages the community, and in doing so, hopefully, it generates awareness about particular causes. So, you know, as I talked about, we're going with bumblebees for a lot of reasons. Um, First, they're easily recognizable. They're large. They have an audible buzz, and so that's great when it comes to collecting data. As Dr. Fraser was talking about towards the end too, a lot of our native pollinator species are declining for a variety of reasons, and that includes a lot of our bumblebee species, actually 50% approximately, and in some cases very severely. Um, the rusty patch bumblebee, the Bombus affinis, is one that used to be common in Michigan up until the late 1990s, and now it's actually extirpated from the state and has received federal designation as being federally endangered. So that's a big deal. So we have 21 bumblebee species in eastern North America, and so the goal of this project is really to focus on what do we have in our Southwest Michigan region, and what can we do to stabilize and even increase those populations. So we started Southwest Michigan Bee Watch, which is our citizen science program. Really, as I talked about, with a goal to uh, figure out what kind of bumblebee diversity we have in Southwest Michigan. We're going to use this data to hopefully inform future land management practices, depending on what kind of species we have and how it correlates with certain landscapes and habitat types. So when we say Southwest Michigan, we're talking about the 9 counties of Southwest Michigan. You can see a map here on the left side of your screen. We are particularly interested in some of our nature preserves, the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy properties, the Lilly and Anderson Arboretum, Pierce Cedar Creek Institute, and Kalamazoo Nature Center. But we're not just collecting data from these areas. So if you see a bumblebee in your backyard or your garden, and you're able to get a photo and submit it to the platform that we work through, all the more better. Please do so. We give special interest to these locations because we have previous collections there and data about the land that helps inform our relationships. But absolutely, any data is great data. So one of the first things that we did was we created a public presence. We created a website. And so the URL is here in bold, swimbees.kzoo.edu. On it, on the homepage, you'll find at the bottom, we actually have 2 forms, both of which will add you to our mailing list. And that way you'll receive news on field days and project updates that we may have. It also allows volunteers to submit questions and get information and tips on how to submit sightings and what that looks like. So um, yeah, we really encourage everybody to join. This is something that we would love all the hands that we can get because we really are passionate about conserving bumblebees in this area. So we you join the project and then what, right? So we work through a platform called Bumblebee Watch, which is run by the Xerxes Society. It's a national citizen science database. And so they have a website that we link to in our website. It's called bumblebeewatch.org. On there, you can create an account. It's free, and you'll select Southwest Michigan Bee Watch as as your project and your profile setting. And then from there, you go and take photos of bumblebees in our region, submit them to the website, either on the computer or through their mobile app. And on the left here is a diagram of what that process kind of looks like. So you take the photo, you log in, and you upload it. You'll probably have to identify your species, but we have some tips for that, and that's fairly easy to navigate. And then within a short duration of time, an expert will verify your sighting, and then that data will be official, it'll be up. So in the field, what it kind of looks like is near some wildflower patch or garden or whatever it may be, there'll be tons of pollinators, and of those, of our particular interest is bumblebees. And so in this photo on the left here, really you don't have to get incredibly close or anything. Any camera will do. Although I will say that larger cameras make it easier because you don't have to get as close, but still any camera works. And so, throughout the summer through really now until late fall, bumblebees will be out there, they'll be pollinating, and you take your photos and you upload them to Bumblebee Watch. So this is kind of what it looks like on the mobile app. Um, so it's really nice because it's user friendly. And again, we talked about species earlier, and on the left side of the app, they have illustrations of what the species look like. So there's, as I mentioned, this is a national database, so they have a lot of a lot of bumblebee species, certainly more than the 21 we have in our area. So it's great because the Bumblebee Watch app actually allows you to geographically locate yourself to a very broad area. So our area would be the Chicago area, and that'll list out the 21 species that we have in Michigan. So after you take your photo, you actually pick which species you might think it is, and if you're wrong, that's okay because an expert will verify later. But you click on the bumblebee species, and that'll take you to a page where you're able to view other photos. So you can verify, or you can get description information about the species and where it's located and some of its conservation status notes. You can also see the range and where it's typically found. But when you're ready to submit, in the top right hand corner of all those photos, you'll see the plus sign. And the plus allows you to upload your photo. And from there, you are able to record some notes, perhaps about the weather, and then you hit submit, and it's up in a short time. The expert will verify for you, and so it's really a very it's a simpler process to engage with the public and submit data about what our regional species look like. So on the website that we created, we have some great um, resources for tips about photography, jump bumblebee anatomy, some of the guides that we find helpful in identifying bumblebees. We also have resources on planting native gardens. Dr. Fraser talked about earlier, a great way to get local and native species to certain gardens is to plant flowers that they grow up with. We also have some information on national conservation information and other initiatives out there towards similar goals. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll also see an identification guide that we'll be passing out at field days, and hopefully hope to get up on the site soon. And that's going to help individuals who want to submit their photos. It's going to help them a little bit with figuring out what the species may be if they don't necessarily have experience doing so. So after you submit, your submissions are immediately viewable. A lot of the times they'll say it's pending for expert verification. And right away they'll appear on the map. And so in the bottom right hand corner, you can see 4 green dots of previous bumblebee species sightings. And so in that sense, you're able to see where the photo was taken, what the photo actually was, and the username. And so then again, as I mentioned, experts will verify your submission and will reach out to you when they do verify. So you can actually have some practice identifying species, which is a little bit of a learning curve, but always exciting once you get the hang of it. So then on our end, what we're hoping to do is we're hoping to take all this data and kind of get an idea of what our regional bumblebee species look like, especially in Southwest Michigan. Um, we hope to use this information again to improve and stabilize the bumblebee species presence in this area. So again, the relative abundances of bumblebee diversity in terms of land use and future management practices. Also, what kind of plant diversity we might need to encourage bumblebees to stay in the area. It'll also give us an idea of what kind of time frame certain bumblebees are out, which is important for plantings and things of that nature. So really, the goal of this program is to focus on conserving bumblebee species in Southwest Michigan, but by doing so with the help of the community of Southwest Michigan. Because again, the more that are able to help, all the better will come. So that is all I have. I am going to stop sharing my screen. And
Okay. I'm going to quickly interrupt you for just a second, Nico. So we are at time right now. I just want to respect people's time. If you guys are okay, we do have a few more questions that came in, but just to let people know, it is about 1:00 right now. So are you guys okay staying for a little longer to answer some of the questions?
oh yeah, absolutely.
Sure, sure.
Okay.
And I saw there were some on the chat, so we can always, I don't know if there's a way later to answer those if we don't.
Yep, and I
people
have written down quite a few of them. So let's
Okay.
see if we can get through at least a few of them, and we'll go from there. We had a couple of questions about when is the best time to clean out nests. Kim was asking that and how to clean out the houses. So should we do it in the winter? That came from Facebook.
Mhm. So because a lot of those bees are going to be in the tubes in the winter, that's where it's nice if you can have something that you can pull out and, like take your straw out and put those aside and then clean the rest of the nest. But these things you're not going to reuse, so you're not really going to clean these out. There is a company called Crown Bees, like crown on your head, Crown Bees. They're run out in Oregon, but they have lots of great videos on mason bee stuff because they actually do this stuff commercially. The one thing I will say there is they offer to like ship bees to you, like mason bees to you, but please don't order bees from them because the potential is that there might be diseases that they're carrying, and when those bees get shipped here, that introduces diseases. So there are mason bees around here. You just have to be patient, and they will come. So, but the best time would be, they're going to be finished their nesting in the fall. So if you can unravel these, what they show in the video, sometimes you unravel these things and you scrape the little cocoons out and you keep them in plastic containers. So if you type in mason bees on YouTube, there's going to be all kinds of help videos. So during the winter would be the time to get the cocoons out, and you can put them in your refrigerator to simulate winter if you want, and then take them out in the spring.
That was actually a good segue to another question we had. Someone coming in from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, recognized that all native bees in Michigan aren't the same as there might have in Pennsylvania, but are most of them the same?
Absolutely, yes. Most of them are the same. So all the same measures that you can take for identification guides. You're going to see things mainly for the northeastern U.S. You'll see guides for those. Yeah, they tend to be western bees and eastern bees, and the Rockies is kind of a dividing. But in the east, there's some things they get in the south we don't get, but Pittsburgh would be very similar.
So speaking about other things, Kate had a question of how are you or other area biologists following the Asian hornet invasion on the West Coast?
Yes.
What are your concerns?
Yes, I was in India last December and I got to see some live, and they are large. I did see the news report of sightings in Washington state, and they are, predators of honeybees. So they'll sit around and they will decapitate honeybees as they come in and out of the hive, and they can take down quite a few of them, and they have a powerful sting. Could they survive in the Michigan winters? I'm not sure. I have to look into their biology, but certainly any introduced species, as they mentioned in that article, if they're not able to eradicate them, like in the next year or two from Washington, then by that time they're going to have spread too far and they're established. So let's just hope that they can nip them in the bud. But I'm concerned, absolutely, as with any introduced species.
Okay, so Bobby Joe has a question. She's trying to attract more bees to a large city lot by allowing red clover and dandelions to grow. Yet every week I must mow the lawn to keep the dandelions from populating my neighbor's green oasis. Any advice?
Yeah, that's a tough one, isn't it? I belong to Wild Ones, which is the Native Plant Society. We have a Kalamazoo chapter. I think there's one in Calhoun County. And dandelions are good floral resources for bees. So, and clover is absolutely a great resource for bees, even some non-native clovers. So we there was a suggestion there should be like a no mow May, just like there's a no shave November. Yeah, and let those go because that's when most of the bees are out, and they really need some flowering resources because there's not a lot out there yet. And so if work with your neighbor and can try and convince them, there's some benefits here. Maybe you can mow them right before they go to seed, but let them have their flowering length and then say, I will mow them before they set seed. That would be my suggestion.
Okay, we've got two more that we're going to get to. From Emma on Facebook, why do bees prefer a tube-shaped house?
Right. I mean, if you think of the bee's body, it's kind of cylindrical shape. And so, this particular tube here, the outer part, it can be anything. It doesn't have to be a tube. But I don't know if you're referring to that or if you're referring to these. But the shape of their body they're going to pick a diameter tube that matches their body size. And so that's why it's good to have a range of those. And that's just easy for them to get in and out of. But the housing can be any shape.
All right, our last question. I feel like this is a good ending one. What is the greatest danger to bees at this time?
The greatest danger, I would venture to say, well, two things. One is habitat loss or degradation, because when we convert pesticides, because those poison the bees as they do any insect, and most of those are toxic to us as well.
Awesome. All right. I think we're going to end with those questions today. Thank you guys both.
Thank you.
I know I learned a lot. I think a lot of our people that came on Zoom as well as Facebook learned a lot. I was going to say thank you guys for coming, and I see a lot of thank yous, and this was very informative in the chat box. So
Great. Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, and be
Thank you.
well, everyone.